Hi everyone, Professor Gustin here. And this week we're going to be talking about eukaryotic microorganisms. And in particular, we're going to be talking about fungi and protozoa. And these are really short introductory lectures on these topics. There's a lot of information. You can get a whole PhD in one tiny aspect of studying fungi or protozoa. So um, I'd just like to give you enough in this course to get an appreciation for the variety of microorganisms that microbiology isn't just bacteria, and diseases aren't just caused by bacteria, but there's other organisms too. And there's some pretty cool pictures here. This one is actually a condition caused by a fungus, and it's called body ringworm, and it can stop the growth of hair. So it's really common. It's just something that's in the soil and more annoying than a major problem. There's a cool amoeba. I love amoebas. There's some mold, and this is what you would see on a petri dish. So that's without a microscope. And then these are some protozoans called Giardia, which you might have heard of. So, okay, so I have here on your study guide in section 4.2. I'm going to assume that you have some basic understanding of eukaryotic cells. This course has prerequisites that you would have covered that in. So hopefully you remember a little bit about prerequisites or a little bit about eukaryotic cells, and that they've got lots of organelles and they're bigger than prokaryotes, and they, maybe some of the things these organelles do. But if you don't remember that, it's in the textbook. You can go review that. The other thing is I just wanted you to remind yourself about the three domains of life. And we mentioned this earlier in the semester, but I want to look at this picture again in the context of learning about um, eukaryotes. And so we've been talking, we talked about prokaryotic cells. And remember, the prokaryotes are the bacteria and the archaea. And we're spending most of our conversation talking about bacteria because these are the ones that impact us most day to day. But the other branch here, so if this is a common ancestor, this is the best that we know about evolution right now. And so this branch here went to the eukaryotic organisms. And and you might remember all the five kingdoms. We had the Monera, which were the prokaryotes, and then the animals, and the plants, and the fungi, and then the protists, which is all these other things. All these other things. And so so you'll notice that this eukaryotic branch has most of the kingdoms, and and so these eukaryotic cells are more closely related to each other, and we'll come back to that, some of the ideas there. Oh, I just have on here to look at that the protists don't really have one common ancestor. There's really a great variety of organisms in that group that we lump together. So I want you to describe the characteristics of fungi that distinguish them from all other organisms. So we have this thing called mycology. Mycology is the study of fungi. So there are mycologists around, and they might study macroscopic fungi, things that you can see without a microscope, like mushrooms or molds. So there's just a piece of bread with some mold on it. We've all seen that. They might also study microscopic fungi like yeast. So what do both these macroscopic and microscopic fungi have in common? Well, they're all made of eukaryotic cells. They're non-modal. I've never seen a mushroom running across um, the forest floor. That would be very cool, but I don't think it's ever happened. They don't have a vascular system. So even though, for example, mushrooms were originally classified with plants because they kind of look like plants, but when you look at them, you look at their structure, they don't have xylem and phloem. They don't have, or blood vessels, a vascular system, a system that moves nutrients and fluids throughout the organism. The mushrooms, they're more like sponges. They kind of soak up things. So they always have to be kind of in a little bit moist environment. They don't have chlorophyll, which also distinguishes them from plants. Even though some of these molds are green, they're not photosynthetic. So they're not, they don't have chlorophyll. So that again kind of kicks them out of the plant kingdom. One of the things they do have is they have this stuff called chitin in their walls. And just like, see if you remember from another class, plants have cell walls, animals don't. They just have a cell membrane, but plants have cell walls. And the cell wall is made of a really abundant carbohydrate called cellulose. So plant cell walls are made of cellulose, and so wood is mostly cellulose, whereas fungi have mostly chitin in their walls. And they're, and it's one of our hints that we got that fungi are actually more closely related to animals than any other kingdom of life. If I go back to this picture I had right here, if you look at this evolutionary tree of the three domains here, here we have the animals and the fungi right next to each other. The fungi are actually more closely related to animals than they are to plants, which is, it kind of blows our mind because they look so much like plants, but when you start getting down to the DNA. And so I put a Colorado potato beetle there because I just wanted to remind you that that exoskeleton in insects is also made of chitin, that hard stuff on the outside. And so that's kind of one of the little clues that fungi and animals are a little bit more closely related than they are to plants. There's some unique things about fungal nutrition. So I want you to describe some unique features of fungal nutrition. And this picture is kind of cool because it shows a lot of different kinds of fungi. Here's some mushrooms. Here's some hairy fungi like molds, or they might be mycelia, which we'll talk about in a minute. But here's some other form of fungi growing there. These lichens, you might be familiar with lichens. They're actually a symbiotic relationship between fungi and algae, but they're all growing on this rotting wood. And so fungi are actually heterotrophic organisms. And what that means is they're not photosynthetic, that they're getting their food from an organic food source. So humans are heterotrophs, whereas plants are autotrophs. They get their food, their energy from the sun, and that allows them to make their own food. So, but fungi like animals are heterotrophs. And so where do they get their food? They do a lot of growing on dead things. If you go out in nature and you find rotting wood, or you find a animal that's decomposing, you're probably going to find some fungi. So most are growing on dead plants and animals. But some are found in the human body. We do have normal microbiota that are like things like yeast, that are harmless and growing in the human body. We also have fungi that grow in living organisms that are disease causers, so they're pathogens. Although, if we say about 10% of bacteria are pathogens, it's even lower than that for fungi. The number of pathogenic fungi is relatively low compared to the number of fungi in general. So, and another unique nutritional feature is a lot of them make unique enzymes that decompose things. Remember, cellulose is the cell makes up the cell walls of plants, so there's a lot of cellulose in wood. And actually, bacteria generally do not decompose cellulose. So if you're having if wood is rotting, there's probably fungi involved. So, and it's because they have unique enzymes that can decompose cellulose. Remember, in our diet, cellulose is fiber, and we can't digest fiber. So, even most bacteria can't digest fiber, or can't digest that, especially in the form that you see in nature, like in the form of a tree. So, fungi are really important in decomposing cellulose. Even things like hair and feathers and all. Some fungi have unique enzymes that can decompose them. Another one is some survive in high sugar or salt concentrations in hypertonic solutions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that concept. But the idea is this is going to allow fungi to grow in some places where most bacteria would not. So when you're growing fungi, and if you know you've grown fungi in your house whether you tried to or not, or we try to grow them in the laboratory. But if we grow them in the laboratory, when we look at yeast, the microscopic fungi, the colonies look a lot like bacteria. And I don't know if all fungi or all the fungi, all the yeast that I've ever seen, seem to make really white colonies, and they tend to be, really distinctly white. And but these are typical yeast colonies, and they can look a little bit different than bacterial colonies. But you can grow them on a petri plate. You can streak them out just like we grow bacteria. When we're looking at individual cells of yeast, um, the cells are larger than bacteria. So remember, we said eukaryotic cells are bigger than prokaryotes. And so when I teach the live lab, sometimes I'll give them a, a slide that say, can you figure out what this organism is? And I put yeast on it. And the two things that they should notice is that the yeast cells are a lot bigger than the bacteria they've been looking at. And also, yeast divide by this thing called budding. So if this was a bacterial cell, the bacterial cell would actually divide into two equal sized cells. But with yeast, they kind of make these little buds, and you can see one coming off there too. And so the parent cell is going to, daughter cell is going to bud off the parent cell. And that's a real typical thing you'd see in yeast if you're trying to figure it out, if it's yeast or bacteria. If you're trying to grow mold in the laboratory, they look hairy, and see how nice and shiny and smooth these or these yeast colonies are. But the molds, they look fuzzy or hairy or dusty, and you can even see here it looks like these little fine hairs. And the hairy strands are called hyphae. So these little strands of mold are called hyphae, and masses of hyphae that make up like a whole colony are called mycelium. There's a mushroom. So the mycelium, these hairy things that make up molds, they're not just in mold. So like when we went back here, there's some mycelia. That's what I was talking about, these masses of hyphae, those hairy kind of cellular structures. But mycelium aren't just found in mold. If you actually pull this apart and look at it microscopically, this mushroom, that's going to be mycelia. It's going to be these long, hairy structures. Mushrooms are also they're made of microscopic mycelia. But do you ever notice that all of a sudden one day you look out in your yard and there's just mushrooms everywhere, and they weren't there the day before? And it's like, where the heck did they come from? It's because underground, in the soil where this mushroom popped up, there's a lot of mycelia. And again, here's some of this white that you can see. This is really concentrated. So, but in any soil, you're going to have mycelia, whether you see this white stuff or not. These are these little hair-like structures, and they're all through the soil. And so when the weather conditions get just right, and particularly it means you have just the right amount of moisture, mushrooms can actually pop up from these mycelia above ground. So they said there's about 300 miles of mycelia under the area of 1 footstep of forest soil. So these mycelia are everywhere. They're really important for the soil. Here they are looking at them microscopically. Again, if you were to look in the laboratory, you'd see these little hair-like structures like that. So mushrooms and molds are made of these mycelia, these hair-like structures, and they're all over the place in the soil. If you have, my husband was saying, I can't remember what he said. I'm leaving. Oh, I can't remember what he said I brought in the house and got mold in the house. I'm like, there's mold everywhere. Every piece of dirt or dust has mycelia in it. So it's really easy it's nearly impossible, if not impossible, to keep molds out of your living space. Oh, another cool thing about all these mycelia, these hair-like structures in the soil. So they form this network in the soil. They help plants communicate. There's a thing like if one tree starts being chewed up by a certain kind of insect, the trees next to it will start making chemicals to deter those insects. And people were like, how do the trees communicate with each other? And they found they communicate between these networks of mycelia. They send chemicals through them that other trees can respond to. They can also act as a carbon sink. They lots of carbon ends up in there in the soil, trapped in the soil in mycelia. So in addition to mycelia, mushrooms and molds can also make spores. And the spores in a mushroom are located inside of those gills in the underside of the mushroom. This is a puffball, if you've ever seen one. Some of these puffballs can be as big as softballs. And if you squeeze it, you see this dust, and those are mold spores coming out. Here's a whole petri plate of all different kinds of molds, and the different colors are due to the different kinds of spores they're making. So the different colors are showing you different kinds of molds. So how do fragmentation of hyphae and production of spores allow molds to reproduce? So one thing that can happen is that, so the hyphae are the hair-like structures, and the hyphae can just break off. So here's some hyphae. They can just break off, and if they land somewhere where there's the right nutrients and the right amount of moisture, a new mold can just start growing. So I always, when we get moldy bread, I always just say, leave the bread in the bag, keep it tied up, and just throw it away. Because you open it up and you start taking out the moldy bread and throwing it in the compost pile, you've just introduced so much more mold into your environment. And now usually you're throwing away the moldy bread and you're taking out a new fresh loaf of bread. I don't want all those mold. I don't want all those hyphae breaking off and landing on my fresh bread. So hyphae, just breaking off these hyphae, and they can be microscopic. They can float through the air, and they can create a new fungus. And that would be asexual reproduction, because the new fungus is going to be identical to the original one. When fungi make spores, like they're being made here, because you can tell by the colors, the spores can also kind of float through the air, and a new fungus can grow. Those spores can be produced sexually or asexually. And you might remember that when you reproduce things asexually, you get more. I'm sorry, when you reproduce sexually, you get more genetic variety. Um, but but those also can float through the air and land on another surface and cause a mold to grow. This is just a microscopic picture of some spores. And so there's the hyphae and there's some spores on the ends. Um, One note on spores is we talked about endospores already. And I want you to be aware that fungal spores don't have the properties that endospores have. Fungal spores are actually for reproduction. Remember, endospores are just there to preserve one bacterial cell until environmental conditions improve. So they're really tough. Fungal spores, just like any fungus, can survive, in various environmental conditions, but endospores are really tough. They're going to survive in more extreme conditions. So mold spores or spores from fungi are really there for reproduction, not like endospores. Some characteristics of fungi that allow them to colonize marginal environments, like the walls of a shower. Fungi can survive in environments with relatively low water, low nitrogen, and hard to digest compounds. So our shower gets moist, but then it dries, and it gets moist and dries. So that dampness is enough water for fungi to grow. You're not going to get as many bacteria growing in an environment like this because there's just not enough water there constantly. But fungi can grow in low water and low nutrients, particularly nitrogen. Remember, we said some fungi make some enzymes that digest certain compounds. The lignin is the glue between the cells in plants. Keratin is the waterproofing protein in skin. And if we get a skin infection, it's usually because the bacteria are feeding off of a wound or some secretion from the skin. But some fungi can actually grow on the skin itself and use that for nutrition, particularly because they can digest keratin. And that's tough stuff. Or this is a picture of someone with athlete's foot, a little fungi growing. I have this term called mycosis. Um, give some examples of common plant mycoses. It turns out that, mycoses are diseases caused by fungi. Mycoses are diseases caused by fungi. And so that's plural, mycoses. Singular is mycosis. So mycosis is a disease caused by a fungus. So give some examples of some common plant mycoses. Less than 10% of fungal species cause any type of disease, and I already mentioned that. So there's not there's relatively low numbers of fungal pathogens compared to bacterial pathogens. But as far as mycoses, fungal diseases, there's a lot more plant diseases than animal diseases. So some of the fungal infections or fungal mycoses that you've heard of, you've probably heard about them relative to plants. This picture right here is a picture of, you might have seen this in your garden, of tomato blight. And you see where the plant's getting all black, and that's a fungus that's in the soil. It's really hard to get rid of. It's really common, and it happens typically when the amount of rain is just right. If your plants are planted really closely and there's not a lot of air circulating, it's going to be damper in there, and fungi are going to grow more easily. So if it's rained a lot and your plants are close together, you're more likely to get blight. And that's a fungus. Same as potato blight. It's a certain kind of fungus. This one, in less than 50 years after its emergence in the US, which was in 1904, a fungus virtually eliminated the American chestnut tree as a canopy species. In this part of the country, we had a good proportion of our forests were chestnut trees. And now you rarely see a chestnut tree when you walk around. So 50 years ago, there was a fungus that virtually eliminated the chestnut tree in 8.8 million acres of forest. And so right now, the chestnut trees that are around still risk being killed by this fungus. And apparently, there's a large stand of chestnuts in Wisconsin. And people don't publicize, this is not well publicized that it's there, because more people that go there, the more likely you are to bring that fungus with you, because it's just in soil and it's around and cause the deaths of these chestnut trees. So there are some American chestnut trees around. One of the bigger things that's happening now is people have spent a lot of time crossing Asian chestnut trees, and which are resistant to this fungus, and American chestnuts, and trying to find a tree that will grow well in the US. So there you go. So there are a lot of fungal infections that impact plants. Excuse me. In humans, fungi typically have low virulence, and they're often normal microbiota. And the importance of that, we say they have low virulence, that means they don't cause disease very easily. So fungal pathogens, when you think about all the illnesses you've had, I have a cold right now. That's a virus. We've had bacterial infections. You might have had an earache or a foodborne illness, but we've had lots of viral infections. If we think about the fungal infections we've had, we might have had a yeast infection or maybe athlete's foot or something like that, but very relatively few fungal infections. And what happens is they don't cause disease very easily. And the people that get them usually have something else going on. Most fungal infections we get are because the fungus is an opportunistic pathogen. And what we mean by an opportunistic pathogen, it has low virulence, meaning it doesn't cause disease easily. Most humans are not affected, but these pathogens may cause disease in someone with a weak immune system or another underlying medical condition. Most fungal mycoses in humans are caused by opportunistic pathogens, organisms that are only going to cause disease in somebody that might have a weak immune system or an underlying medical condition. So these things have low virulence. They're not going to cause disease easily. Whoops, there's my title. Explain the concept of an opportunistic pathogen and how it relates to fungi. You can stop the video and catch up and straighten that out. So some of our examples of common human mycoses are yeast infections. There's one, pneumocystis pneumonia, which is a yeast-like organism. It's kind of an odd organism, but it was one of the pathogens that was found in AIDS patients originally. And we're thinking, why are these people getting this? Because most people can carry this pathogen and never get sick from it. So why are these AIDS patients getting it? Well, it turns out they had weakened immune systems. There's something called histoplasmosis that you can get from inhaling bird droppings. And you can see that in the Midwest, it's much more common, but you'll find that a large percentage of people that live in these areas have antibodies against this fungus, but never got sick from it. So only those people that have some underlying medical condition usually, or have just a weakened immune system for some reason, will get that illness, even though it's quite a common fungus. Name and describe some of the conditions caused by species of tinea. And you've heard of tinea, and here's all these different species, and you do not need to memorize which is which, but you've heard of some of these. I never actually heard of tinea barbae. It's a fungus that you get in the beard, in your man's beard or a person's beard. Different species of tinea cause things like athlete's foot, jock itch, and body ringworm. So this is one of those fungi that can actually grow on the skin. This one right here is body ringworm, and it's the fungus is growing. It grows kind of like in a circle, and it can prevent, sometimes it prevents your skin. You might notice you get a white spot when you tan, when you go out in the sun, or you might notice on a pet that they lose their hair. And so that would be from that fungus. And you can treat it. You can treat it with the same medicine that you would treat for athlete's foot or jock itch. There's athlete's foot. And here's what that fungus looks like under the microscope, but it's actually growing on the skin there. So that's a really common species of fungi that cause mycoses in humans and animals. Another mycosis is another pathogen that causes mycoses are yeast. And what causes yeast infections? Well, when somebody gets a yeast infection, it's usually by this organism called Candida albicans, or you might say they have candidiasis, and that would be a yeast infection. And again, here's a picture of some fungi growing, and you can see this one actually has kind of mycelia and yeast cells. So some fungi grow like that too. We have yeast as our normal microbiota. And so why would we get yeast infection? Usually there's some disruption that allow these normal microbiota to overgrow. You might be immunocompromised. You might be taking antibiotics. Vaginal yeast infections are really common. And one of the reasons why women tend to get vaginal yeast infections goes back to that thing that said yeast can grow in relatively high concentrations of sugar. And when a woman is eating a lot of sugar or has diabetes and their blood sugar is relatively high, vaginal secretions can also be more sugary. And that can encourage the growth of sugar. So if you are prone to vaginal yeast infections, try stopping eating sugar for 3 days. And there's a good chance that you will get it under control. So you're disrupting your normal microbiota. Oh, there we go. Women with diabetes are susceptible to yeast infections because of the high sugar in their secretions. The second to last thing I want to say about fungi is why can mycoses be difficult to treat? And why are antifungal drugs, why do they tend to be relatively toxic? Well, here's a picture of somebody with nail fungus. And even nail fungus, which seems like it wouldn't be that big of a deal, can be really hard to treat. And the drugs you give someone to get rid of nail fungus can actually damage their liver. And so you have to get, like, if you're taking them over a long period of time, you need to get your liver enzymes tested to see if your liver is working normally. So why is that? Why are fungi so hard to treat? Well, one is that they're eukaryotes. We're eukaryotes. So a chemical that's going to damage the nail fungus is also going to damage our own cells. Remember, prokaryotic cells have some things that are different. Eukaryotic cells, animal cells, are much more similar to fungal cells, so the drugs can be toxic to us too. There's a relatively low number of drugs available to treat fungi, and again, that comes in because fungi are similar to our own cells. Remember, bacteria have peptidoglycan. So that's something we don't have. So drugs that attack peptidoglycan can kill bacteria, but not us. Bacteria have ribosomes that are different than ours. So drugs that attack bacterial ribosomes won't attack ours. Fungi are very similar to us. So drugs that attack fungi very frequently are also toxic to our human cells. The other one, remember we said, if you're getting fungal infections, it might be because you have a weakened immune system. So giving drugs to people with weakened immune systems can also make it harder to get rid of a pathogen. Nail fungus can take months to cure and might require regular liver tests because they can be very toxic. The last thing I want to talk about fungi is something people are always wondering. Like, I've got mold in my house. We got to, sell the house or tear down the walls. Well, everybody's got mold in their house. Some people have more than others. If there is dampness, there is mold. What happens is some molds make toxins, and some people are very sensitive to these toxins. This varies tremendously from person to person. Most mold is not going to cause you a problem, but it is a good idea when you start getting a lot of mold, like you're seeing here, or even approaching that amount, that the toxins can go into the air and it can irritate your lungs. So it is important to get rid of it. Excess mold is associated with dampness. The best way to control mold is to control dampness. I have a rec room down in my downstairs that's always damp. And I keep a dehumidifier, and actually I keep a fan blowing there all the time. Fans can do wonders for keeping moisture from accumulating on walls. So you're having a mold problem, you're actually having a moisture problem, and you need to control the moisture. So that's it. That's a long video for us, but that's fungi.